The Reverend Dr. Daryl Smith, of which some of you are familiar, pointed me to an interesting quote that comes from a rabbi who lived about 700 years ago. His name is Maimonides, or also known as Ramban. And in his commentary on Leviticus, he had this interesting phrase. He said that holiness is the aspiration to go beyond the letter of the law. Holiness is the aspiration, the desire to go beyond the letter of the law. Now, I see in your eyes just how uncomfortable you might be, and that might be because we just stood for the longest amount of time ever in church history, or because we're talking about threshing floor and eating and drinking and uncovering feet on Children's Sunday, no less. The Spirit has a funny way of working, doesn't it? But whatever it is, I want to draw your attention to that Maimonides quote this morning as we come before Ruth 3. And I want to hold that quote alongside an image of a figure from America's own history, a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer is someone I kind of became fascinated with a year ago, and I read several books about her in the summer of 2023. And if you don't know who Fannie Lou Hamer was, she is kind of a low-lying profile figure, but a really important person in the civil rights movement. Fannie Lou Hamer came from Sunflower County, Mississippi, right in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. And she was educated till the 6th grade, then had to go and serve as a tenant farmer, a crop share worker in picking cotton. And from a young age, she did that until she was 45, when she learned at a meeting in a local church that she was actually guaranteed the right to vote by the U.S. Constitution. She did not know that before age 45. And that fact set her off on a whole new journey, one that took her across the nation, leading and rallying and encouraging people to stand up for the rights of African Americans in this country. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer was so fascinating to me because she broke every single mold that America had of African American women up until that point. She was very little formal education in her background, and yet she went out and spoke to mass crowds. And in fact, she gave a very noteworthy speech at the 1964 Democratic Convention, in which LBJ, President Johnson, felt so threatened by her presence that he interrupted her speech in order to hold an emergency press conference, just so that they would get her off the screen. She went around the country demanding the right for work and for vote and for equality for African Americans. And she had famous lines that you've probably heard of, such as, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." Or maybe you've heard, "Until I am free, you are not free either." Whatever it is, Fannie Lou Hamer is this mysterious figure who deserves more recognition, because not only is she a forerunner of the womanist movement in the United States, but she broke these molds and rewrote the story for what it meant to be an African American woman in this country. And I love Fannie Lou Hamer because she's a holy figure, but not a moral figure. She's a holy figure, but not a moral figure. And I want to hold up that tension for us today when we come before Ruth 3, the difference between holiness and mere morality. You see, friends, I think in recent history, the church has confused the two. We've made holiness synonymous with morality, when in fact, oftentimes they come into conflict and are contradicting each other. See, morality is often set by the culture or society at the time, right? We decide what's good and what's bad, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And holiness is a different category altogether. Holiness is being like God. For in fact, in the book of Leviticus, it says, "Be holy as I am holy." That's God saying that to the people of Israel. And that's the quote from which Maimonides had his ideas about what holiness is. Holiness is something different from morality. Morality sounds like this: don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go with girls who do. I'm sure you've heard that said before, and I'm sure you've heard it in a church context before. Right? The church has confused morality with who you can spend time with or who you shouldn't spend time with. What kind of behaviors you can engage in and what behaviors you must avoid. What you can say or think and what you can't say or can't think. But holiness is something altogether, something greater than going beyond the mere letter of the law. You see, morality is checking those boxes, saying, I did the right thing, I didn't do the wrong thing, I'm good. But holiness seeks something far greater. It's not about my clean conscience or looking good in the eyes of my fellow citizens. Holiness is about serving my neighbor who's in need. And oftentimes, morality keeps us from engaging in that holy work of serving those who are suffering. You see, the closer we keep to the letter of the law is often the way we stay farther and farther away from the least and the last and the lost. Chris Green, who's one of my favorite theologians, Chris Green says this. He says, we have confused sinfulness with being immoral, when oftentimes sinfulness is depriving the joy of the Lord that is supposed to come alive in my neighbor. You see, we've made sin an individual matter by making sin about morality, when in fact sin is an interpersonal matter. What I do affects you and vice versa. And so when I cut you off from that relationship, when I can make it about me and Jesus, then I don't have to worry about you any longer. But people like Fannie Lou Hamer, people like Maimonides, people like Ruth here in this story remind us that holiness is something far greater. But the fact that we have confused holiness with mere morality is revealed in that we are very uncomfortable with stories like Ruth 3, that we don't want to hear them read in places of worship on a children's Sunday because it's not clean. It's not pure. What Ruth does is naughty. She's not supposed to be visiting men in the middle of the night at a place like the threshing floor. And yet she does. And what's more, her actions are called righteous and blessed by Boaz, who's supposed to be this man of great character and virtue in the city of Bethlehem. What's going on here? Well, remember, if you were here last week, you heard at the end of Ruth chapter 2 that Boaz gave Ruth and Naomi somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds of wheat, of grain, so that they could live off of that until the end of the harvest time. Well, now we pick up in Ruth 3, and the end of the harvest time has come. And Ruth and Naomi, they're still living without a social safety net. They've got no men in their lives, no husbands, no father figures. And so at this time in the ancient world, women who were left without male figures were often in big trouble. They were left destitute to their own devices. And oftentimes they had to turn to less saintly matters in order to survive. So here at verse 1 of chapter 3, Naomi comes up with a plan. They're running out of food, and she says, "This is your one chance, fancy. Don't let me down." I get that from Reverend Ben Trammell, who's a mentor figure in my life. He says this is the fancy moment of the Bible. But that's exactly what's going on here. Naomi says it's time for you to get dressed up and look really nice, and you're going to go to Boaz after he's eaten and drank to his heart's content, and you're going to make a move. You're going to seek out his companionship, and then he will take you in and make you part of his family. Now, there's a word that's used here that translates as next of kin in our translation. It's also kinsman redeemer. Kinsman redeemer is an idea in the ancient Near East where if someone had to sell their land because they were in debt, then a family member was obligated to buy that land back on behalf of the poor family member, to keep the land within the family circle. You see, the goal in ancient Israel was not to have massive feudal estates with a bunch of peasants working them. The idea was that every family would have a bit of land and that they would all have some property and they would work together in community and in mutuality. And so when somebody would sell their land, the family would have to act to buy it back, to get that person out of debt. Well, kinsman redeemer seems to be coming in that same kind of vein. When somebody is suffering and without any kind of monetary or financial stability, then a family member needs to take them in. And so what Boaz can be is somebody who marries Ruth and then takes Naomi, the mother-in-law, in by extension to give them security and financial stability. And so Ruth goes and she initiates. She's bold. Now, there's a pastor in the Presbyterian church. His name is Peter Leithart, and he wrote a fantastic essay about this moment in Ruth chapter 3. And Peter Leithart says, when Ruth comes to the threshing floor in the middle of the night, if you're an ancient Israelite, you're remembering all of those stories in the Torah about the Moabite women and how they behave sexually. And when they show up around Israelite men, they lead the men of Israel away from worship of God to worship of other gods, foreign gods, idols. And there's stories about their sexual impropriety time after time in the Torah. And so we come to the book of Ruth, and if we're faithful listeners who know the story of God and God's people, and we see this Moabite woman coming to the threshing floor, we already know the ending. We know where this is going. And it's nowhere good for Boaz. See, we knew exactly who Ruth was this whole time. She was no better than the other Moabites. All she's here to do is mess things up. But then we remember who Ruth has been up until this point in chapter 3. If you were here a few weeks ago at the beginning of chapter 1, we talked about how Ruth was the embodiment of this idea of chesed. Hesed is a Hebrew word that means loving kindness or steadfast love, covenant loyalty. It's the quality that God embodies toward the people of Israel when they're in covenant relationship. That God will never forsake them, but will be steadfast and devoted in God's love toward them. And one of the striking claims here in the book of Ruth is that the person who best embodies God's love for Israel is this Moabite woman. And so we come to the threshing floor. This is the climax of this entire book. She shows up, and we're wondering what's going to happen. Is she going to be the faithful person who embodies God's love, or is she just going to be another Moabite woman? And instead of proving what happens time after time in Israel's history to be true again, Ruth shows up and rewrites the story. Yes, she lies down at Boaz's feet. But when he wakes up, he does not expose her to public disgrace. He does not humiliate her in front of the entire community. But Boaz can see Ruth for who she truly is. Remember, we talked about that last week when they encountered each other in Boaz's fields. Boaz can see her as a child of God, a daughter who belongs within the family of Israel, even though she's a Moabite. And here in the middle of the night, he sees her again and says, "My daughter, who are you?" And then he takes her in. And if you remember from last week in chapter 2, Boaz made this blessing, this prayer, where he asked that God would spread God's wing over Ruth and protect her. Well, here in chapter 3, what does Ruth say when Boaz wakes up and says, "Who are you? What's going on?" She says, I'm in 1 Samuel, so that won't do us any good. I'm getting ahead of the story. She says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant." Ruth is demanding that Boaz act on the promise of blessing that he has invoked in God's name. Be about it. Don't just talk about it. And Boaz does. He receives her. The amount of trust, the amount of hopefulness that all three of these characters have in each other, Ruth, Naomi, Boaz, is incredible. And it takes that level of trust in order for this to not turn out into a situation of public disgrace and humiliation. Instead of exposing her to the rest of the town, Boaz blesses her and says, "We're going to make this work. I'm looking out for you." But what I want you to see is that this moment of possible scandal becomes a place where God's salvific action occurs. Because Ruth has acted for the sake of her family, for Naomi, not just herself. She's looking out for her mother-in-law. And so she puts her name and her reputation on the line and does something that would be very, very courageous, to say the least. And Boaz can see it. And he reciprocates this bold action by taking her in and by not turning her out. Now, if you remember later on in the story, a descendant of Ruth and Boaz, not to give it away, is a man called Jesus. And if you remember his parents in Matthew 1, Joseph finds out that Mary's pregnant. And he has in mind to divorce her quietly until the angel of the Lord intercedes. Where do you think he got this idea from, this behavior to be resolved and steadfast? Not just from angelic intervention, but also it's in his history. That Boaz sees the courage of this young Moabite woman and honors it. What could have been scandalous becomes salvific. You see, this is what happens when we confuse holiness and morality, is that we miss the point of stories like Ruth chapter 3. We make it all about what Ruth's behavior is and what she should or shouldn't do with her body, or how she should or shouldn't relate to men in the middle of the night. When what the writer wants to tell us is that this woman is taking massive, massive risk in her life for the sake of another in need, her mother-in-law, who's starving and without any hope. And so she risks her name for that sake. And I wonder what that could mean for us today, the church. For people who get caught up in the tension of morality and holiness, trying to be the people that society wants us to be versus the people God has called us to be. And how often those come into conflict. When we see our neighbor in need and we feel the tension of how we should act toward them versus how society says we should feel about them or see them. I wonder if you've ever felt that tension before. And I wonder what Ruth 3 might provoke or inspire in you to recall that holiness is the aspiration to go beyond the mere letter of the law, to be something more, to be the living God who reaches out in compassionate and courageous service to those who are suffering and in need. A few years ago, I came across the story of Father Boyle, Gregory Boyle, who is a Jesuit priest who works in Los Angeles. And you might know Father Gregory Boyle because he's also the executive director and founder of Homeboy Industries, which is a gang intervention and prevention program in the middle of Los Angeles. So he saved hundreds, if not thousands, of young men's lives and women's lives by interceding and showing them a better way. Now, before he founded Homeboy Industries, Father Boyle was at a church, a parish called Dolores Mission. And around that area was a large population of people who were unhoused. And so Father Boyle and the other Jesuit priests made the decision to start letting these men and women sleep inside the church at night, to let them reside within the walls of the parish. Now, after a while, their presence lingered far after they had left the building. You could smell them when you showed up to Mass on Sunday mornings. And if you know anything about church people, because I'm chief among them, we like to complain about how the building is, right? That's what we do. When it smells, when it doesn't look good, the complaints go up. And so people began to complain to the priests about the smell inside the building. So one Sunday, the Jesuit priests got up and part of the sermon became interactive. And the priest said, "What does the church smell like?" And somebody was bold enough to shout out, "It smells like feet." So then the priest asked, "Why does it smell like feet?" Somebody else in the congregation said, "Because the homeless sleep here." And then the priest said, "Why do the homeless sleep here?" It was quiet. And then somebody else said, "Because we've committed to serving them." And then the priest said, "Why have we committed to serving the homeless?" Somebody else said, "Because Jesus tells us to." Then the priest asked again, "So, now, what does the church smell like?" The people thought. And somebody shouted out, "It smells like commitment." And then an older woman shouted out, "It smells like roses." The smell didn't change, but the people's understanding of the smell changed. Do you see the difference? What if we could be scandalous like Fannie Lou Hamer? What if we smelled like feet that then became roses? What if people looked at us and in awe they said, "Who are you?" like Boaz said to Ruth? Would they not see the glory of a God whose holiness is serving the people in need?
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time